Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Today I Found Out, and in the video today, why are crazy people called mad as a hatter? Although the phrase mad as a hatter is and will likely long be associated with Charles Dodgson's, a.k.a. Lewis Carroll's 1865 novel Alice in Wonderland, contrary to popular belief, Carroll neither coined this phrase nor did he use it in his works. The Hatter is referred to as mad along with his little tea party, but is never explicitly called Mad Hatter in Carroll's works, nor is the phrase mad as a hatter used. So where did the phrase mad as a hatter actually come from? The first documented instance of the phrase can be found in the 1829 short story Noctes Ambrosianae, published in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine. North. Many years I was Sultan of Bello for a long period, until dethroned by an act of the grossest injustice, but I intend to expose the traitorous conspirators to the indignation of an outraged world. Tickler, aside to Shepherd. He's raving. Shepherd to Tickler. Demented. Oddity to both. Mad as a hatter. Hand me a cigar. The next known documented instance of it appears in the 1835 work The Clockmaker by Canadian Thomas Chandler Halliburton. And with that, he turned right round and sat down to his map and never said another word, looking as mad as a hatter the whole blessed time. And later in that same work, Father, he laughed out like anything. I thought he would never stop, and Sister Sal got right up and walked out of the room as mad as a hatter. Says she, Sam, I do believe you are a born fool, I vow. The leading theory as to the origin of the phrase is that it refers to a genuine condition that began afflicting certain hat makers in the 17th century called Mad Hatter's Syndrome or Hatter's Shakes. The symptoms associated with this condition were first described in full detail in 1829 by a Russian physician. The same year, the first known instance of the expression came about. It continued to be a problem for hat makers through the 19th century in much of the Western world, though in the US it was a phenomenon that continued into the mid-20th century for reasons that we're going to get to in a bit. As for the underlying cause of Mad Hatter syndrome, in the 17th century in France, expensive hats made of felt began being produced using mercury nitrate. The method in question seems to have been developed by the Huguenots of France, who, after Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which had previously given them certain religious freedoms and rights, were forced to flee to Britain, where they soon shared their little trade secret with British hatters, with it spreading out from there. The specific felt production method here was to use mercury nitrate in a solution used to strip fur from animal skin, usually from a rabbit or a beaver, in a process known as carroting, so called because of the orangish color of the mercury nitrate solution. The specific benefit to the mercury nitrate here was to cause the stiffer outer hairs to soften and become limp, allowing the hatters to pack them more easily. After carroting, the resulted matted fur was shrunk in boiling water and then dried. The processed felt, subsequently used for hat making, continued to emit mercury vapor for some time after carroting. Hat makers rarely wore any kind of safety equipment or protective clothing back then, and often worked in cramped, extremely poorly ventilated workspaces. Because of this, invariably they were exposed to dangerous amounts of mercury vapors during their day-to-day lives, culminating in prevalent mercury poisoning among those in the industry. The symptoms of mercury poisoning are numerous and, in many cases, extremely severe. It affects the heart, brain, lungs, kidneys, and in some cases, the immune system, among other things. Most pertinent to the topic at hand, neurological symptoms associated with mercury poisoning can include, but are not limited to, abnormal sensations in the limbs, muscle tremors, erratic mood changes, and mental deterioration. The behavior of those affected by mercury poisoning is usually represented as anxiety, extreme timidness, and a general desire to remain unobserved, usually responding with anger or irritability if this wish is ignored. Back in the halcyon days of the 18th and 19th century, when these symptoms were seen simply as a necessary aspect of making nice hats, instead of, a debilitating avoidable health concern, people simply referred to the condition as the Hatter's Shakes, with little effort initially being expended to discover the underlying cause of them. Over in America, hat makers, well, they didn't fare any better, with those suffering from what medical literature would later more accurately define as mercurial tremors experiencing a similar amount of apathy towards fixing or preventing the problem being demonstrated. The condition was also known to some in the 1850s as the Danbury Shakes, Danbury being the largest hat-making town in America at the time. In 1860, a treatise on common ailments that seemed to affect a large percentage of New Jersey hatters was written by physician Addison Freeman, titled Mercurial Disease Among Hatters. It was published in the Transactions of Medical Society of New Jersey. Freeman noted in the paper, which was completely ignored by the local industry, "A proper regard for the health of this class of citizens demands that mercury should not be used so extensively in the manufacture of hats, and that if its use is essential, that the hat finisher's room should be large, with a high ceiling, and well ventilated." 1 year later, Adolf Kussmaul wrote at length about the symptoms of mercury poisoning in 1861, including briefly mentioning hatters in the work. As a result of mercury now correctly being identified as the culprit behind Mad Hatter syndrome, alternate methods of processing the fur were developed over the following decades. This resulted in mercury being phased out of the production of felt hats in places like France and Britain by the end of the 19th century, but not in the United States. As one report in the Bureau of Statistics of Labor and Industries of New Jersey noted in 1890 concerning the conditions at hatters' workshops, "The surprise is that men can be induced to work at all in such death-producing enclosures. It is hard to believe that men of ordinary intelligence could be so indifferent to the ordinary laws of health. It does not seem to have occurred to them that all the efforts to keep up wages are largely offset by the impairment of their health due to neglect of proper hygienic regulations of their workshops. And when the fact of the workmen in the sizing room who stand in water was mentioned, and the simple and inexpensive means by which it could be largely avoided was spoken of, the reply was that it would cost money, and hat manufacturers did not care to expend money for such purposes if they could avoid it." Another report, Chronic Mercury Poisoning, noted of hatters in the 1940s, "The man affected is easily upset and embarrassed, loses all joy in life, and lives in constant fear of being dismissed from his job. He has a sense of timidity and may lose self-control before visitors. Thus, if one stops to watch such a man in a factory, he will sometimes throw down his tools and turn in anger on the intruder, saying he cannot work if watched. Occasionally, a man is obliged to give up work because he can no longer take orders without losing his temper, or if he is a foreman, because he has no patience with men under him. Drowsiness, depression, loss of memory, and insomnia may occur, but hallucinations, delusions, and mania are rare. The most characteristic symptom, though it is seldom the first to appear, is mercurial tremor. It is neither as fine nor as regular as that of hypothyroidism. It may be interrupted every few minutes by coarse, jerky movements. It usually begins in the fingers, but the eyelids, lips, and tongue are affected early. As it progresses, it passes to the arms and legs, so that it becomes very difficult for a man to walk about the workshop, and he may have to be guided to his bench. At this stage, the condition is so obvious that it is known to the layman as Hatter's Shakes. Rampant mercury poisoning among hatters and felt makers didn't end in the United States until World War II. In 1941, the US Public Health Service convened a meeting with representatives from the felt and hat-making industries to force them to use an alternative method of felt production. While it may seem like they were doing this only out of concern for the workers, in fact, they had long known about this particular problem within the industry. The real impetus for finally doing something about it was to conserve mercury for use in the war, with a side benefit being better working conditions for felt producers. With the push, the industry representatives agreed to switch to using a different, well-known method of felt production using prevalent and cheap hydrogen peroxide. In any event, Lewis Carroll would have been well aware of the symptoms of Mad Hatter syndrome, as he grew up in Stockport, one of the major hat-making hubs of England at the time. Nevertheless, seemingly intentionally, Carroll's hatter, while a bit of an oddball, does not portray the typical symptoms associated with mercury poisoning, such as extreme shyness, shakes, loss of self-confidence, and timidness to an excessive degree. This type of behavior couldn't contrast more with the exuberant and jovial personality of the character, a fact that probably wasn't lost on Carroll's original audience. Later, Carroll injects a little subtle reference to the syndrome when the King of Hearts tells the Hatter not to be nervous, a seemingly uncontrollable trait of Mad Hatters of the day, lest he execute him on the spot. It has also been speculated, with no hard evidence to back this notion up, so take it with a very large grain of salt, that Carroll based the character on Theophilus Carter, a noteworthy furniture dealer who lived at 48 High Street, Oxford, while Carroll was an Oxford don. Carter was considered something of an eccentric who, according to the British Medical Journal, is known to have been called the Mad Hatter, presumably referencing his oddball behavior and the fact that he purportedly almost always went around wearing a large top hat. Pertinent to the topic at hand, Theophilus once invented a particularly useful alarm clock presented at the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park in 1851 that, at the appropriate time, would tip the bed over, unceremoniously dumping the sleeping occupant onto the floor. It has been speculated, again with zero documented evidence backing this idea up, that this particular invention inspired Carroll, a little over a decade later, to make the Hatter obsessed with time in Alice in Wonderland. And now for a bonus fact. If mercury poisoning wasn't enough, New Jersey hatters in the late 19th century had another major ailment to contend with due to the extremely poor working conditions that they were made to endure, and that was tuberculosis. In fact, nearly 2/3 of hatters in New Jersey were dead of a pulmonary disease by 30 years old. The rates of mercury poisoning among this same group was reported to be as high as 50%, with this number thought to be low, given that many workers would attempt to mask their symptoms for fear of losing their jobs. In the 1930s, the US Public Health Service reported the condition appearing in a whopping 80% of all felt makers. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, I'd like to thank our patrons on Patreon. Join them at patreon.com/TodayIFoundOut if you want to support us. And as always, thank you for watching.